There are moments in music history when a single voice seems to rise above the noise, carrying the hopes of an entire city. Chicago once knew such a voice. It belonged to a young man who grew up far from the spotlight, yet somehow became one of the brightest lights of the Chicago soul era. His name was Major Lance. He was the kind of artist who could turn a simple melody into a memory, the kind who made people dance even when life felt heavy. But how does someone so deeply connected to a city's heartbeat slowly fade into its shadows? And why did a career filled with promise end in silence? Let's get into Major Lance's story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the spotlight ever found him, before his voice filled dance halls across the Midwest, Major Lance was a boy shaped by the quiet struggles of the rural South. Born on the 4th of April 1939 in Wyville, Mississippi, he grew up during a time when life demanded strength from the very beginning. He was one of 12 children raised by his mother, Lindy Lance, in a world where every day required resilience. Even the debate over his official birth year couldn't change the simple truth that his childhood was marked by poverty, discipline, and deep family bonds. As a young boy, he loved movement. He played baseball in open fields, raced through dusty roads, and listened to the gospel music that rose from small churches across the community. Those sounds, carried through warm southern evenings, planted the earliest seeds of rhythm inside him. But Mississippi offered few real opportunities for a child with big dreams. Like many African-American families in the mid-20th century, the Lances made a life-changing decision. They left the South and headed toward the promise of the North. Chicago was a world away from Wyville. The family settled first on the west side before moving into Cabrini Green, a massive housing project known for its challenges, but also for its strong sense of community. For Major, the transition was overwhelming at first. The city was louder, faster, and harder. But it was also a place where possibility felt close enough to touch. Cabrini Green became the backdrop for his teenage years, shaping the toughness and ambition he would rely on for the rest of his life. He grew quickly into his tall frame, eventually standing 6'6", and sports became his first outlet. Basketball, baseball, and especially boxing helped him build confidence. Curtis Mayfield later said he was a sparky fellow, full of energy and charm. But sports were only part of his story. Music had been following him quietly since childhood, waiting for the moment when it would step into the foreground. That moment came during his time at Wells High School. Fate placed him alongside two classmates who would help define the future of American music, Curtis Mayfield and Jerry Butler. Another close friend, Otis Leavell Cobb, became like a brother to him. Together they dreamed, practiced, argued, and pushed one another to do better. It was an unlikely incubator for talent, a public school in a rough Chicago neighborhood, yet it produced voices that would echo across generations. Major's path into music was gradual but undeniable. He and Otis joined a gospel group called the Five Gospel Harmonaires. Singing gospel helped him understand harmony, timing, and emotional expression. It also gave him something he didn't have before, the belief that he could stand in front of people and hold their attention. Around the same time, he developed a deep admiration for Jackie Wilson, studying his performance style and charisma. But his biggest influence stood right beside him in the school hallways. Curtis Mayfield carried a book bag filled with handwritten songs. Major would often dig through it, searching for the songs Curtis didn't plan to give to the impressions. Mayfield laughed about it years later, saying Major had an uncanny ability to know which melody had potential. Even then, Major Lance had the instincts of a performer. In the late 1950 period, he started looking for a way into the entertainment world. His natural stage presence led him to appear on a local youth show called Time for Teens. When presenter Jim Lounsbury noticed his charisma, he offered Major a small opportunity, a short-term recording chance with Mercury Records. For many teenagers, it would have been a miracle. For Major, it was a beginning. In 1959, he recorded I Got a Girl, written and produced by Curtis Mayfield. The recording didn't chart. It didn't lead to a full contract. But it awakened something inside him. He realized he belonged in a recording studio, that his voice felt at home behind a microphone. And once he understood that, he refused to walk away. The years that followed were full of quiet struggle. Major worked odd jobs across Chicago, doing whatever he could to support himself while still pursuing music. He walked into record offices uninvited, introduced himself to executives, and talked about the record he had made. He reminded them, again and again, that he knew Curtis Mayfield. Persistence became his signature. He visited OK Records so often that employees began to recognize him. He offered to run errands, organize paperwork, anything that might keep him close to the music world. Slowly, the staff listened. Slowly, the doors began to open. And in 1962, everything changed. Major Lance signed with OK Records, the label that, with the help of Curtis Mayfield, would transform him from a determined Chicago kid into one of the defining voices of Chicago soul. By the time Major Lance signed with OK Records in 1962, he had already spent years knocking on closed doors. What set him apart wasn't fame or experience, but determination. He walked into OK so often that the staff began recognizing him before he said a word. He didn't come from privilege or established connections. He came from Chicago's streets, carrying little more than ambition and a belief that music was the only path forward. OK Records itself was at a crossroads. The label had history, but it needed new energy, a fresh voice that could help define the sound of the next decade. Curtis Mayfield believed Major Lance could be that voice. Their friendship stretched back to high school, and Mayfield knew Major had a sense of melody and rhythm that felt genuine. He wasn't a powerhouse vocalist. He didn't need to be. What he had was a warm, youthful tone that made listeners trust him from the first note. Once Major began recording at OK, the pieces started falling into place. The label assembled a team around him that would become central to the Chicago soul sound. Curtis Mayfield as songwriter and producer, Carl Davis as the guiding force behind the sessions, and Johnny Pate as arranger. Each brought a different strength. Mayfield crafted emotional stories. Davis kept everything moving. Pate gave the music polish. And Major brought charm, the kind that couldn't be taught. His early studio sessions were a learning experience. Not every song worked. Some recordings lacked momentum, others didn't quite fit his voice. But Major's resilience showed. He listened closely, studied the phrasing Curtis used, and adapted quickly. He had a gift for understanding what made a song feel good. He could hear a melody once, and instinctively know how to shape it. Curtis Mayfield later said Major was one of the best at picking songs, choosing the ones that connected with people rather than the ones that impressed critics. At OK, Major wasn't alone. The impressions often provided background vocals, and their harmonies created a familiar cushion behind his lead. The blend was smooth, upbeat, and instantly recognizable. It was the kind of sound that made people smile without realizing it. Together, they built something bright and full of motion, a style that felt both modern and rooted in Chicago's musical history. But early results were mixed. Some singles failed to grab attention. Radio stations hesitated. For a young artist trying to support a growing family, the pressure was real. Still, he never wavered. He arrived at the studio prepared, stayed late, and remained willing to take direction. His persistence strengthened his partnership with Curtis Mayfield, who continued writing with Major's tone in mind. As 1962 came to an end, a new idea began circulating, a playful, rhythmic song built around a dance that was spreading across Chicago. It had an easy hook, a catchy groove, and the kind of upbeat simplicity that Major handled well. When he stepped up to the microphone to record it, the energy in the room changed. The musicians felt it. The producers felt it. And Major felt it most of all. The Monkey Time was about to pull him from the background into the center of Chicago soul. His rise had truly begun. When The Monkey Time was finally released in 1963, it didn't just introduce a new single. It introduced Major Lance to the country. The moment the opening groove hit the airwaves, something clicked. The record had everything Chicago soul stood for: bright horns, a steady beat, effortless charm, and a voice that sounded like it was smiling through the microphone. Major performed it with a sense of ease, as if he had been waiting his whole life for a song that fit him this naturally. Radio stations picked it up quickly. Teenagers responded instantly, dancing in living rooms, gyms, and community centers. The song captured a moment in American culture when dance crazes were sweeping the nation, and The Monkey Time helped define the movement. What made it stand out wasn't just its rhythm, but its personality. It felt fun, light, and youthful. It felt like Major Lance. For OK Records, The Monkey Time was a breakthrough they desperately needed. It became the label's first major hit in nearly 10 years, revitalizing their confidence and proving that Chicago had its own sound to offer, one that didn't need to imitate Detroit or New York. Curtis Mayfield's writing, Johnny Pate's arrangements, and Major Lance's delivery formed a triangle that worked with rare precision. Together, they had created something that resonated far beyond Chicago's city limits. The success of The Monkey Time wasn't a momentary flash. It opened doors for Major that had been closed for years. He appeared on national television shows, performed on tours, and began headlining concerts across the Midwest. Crowds responded to him with enthusiasm. Major didn't just sing, he entertained. He moved with confidence, turning simple steps into a style that connected with audiences of every age. In the months that followed, the team continued their momentum. Songs like Hey Little Girl, The Matador, and built on the success of his breakout hit. Each carried the same feeling: bright, catchy, and unmistakably Chicago. Major's voice carried a sincerity that made even simple lyrics memorable. He had a way of making listeners feel like he was singing directly to them. With every new release, his personality became clearer. He wasn't trying to be a dramatic soul crooner or a gritty blues singer. He was the clean, joyful face of Chicago soul, a performer who brought energy and optimism at a time when the country needed it. His records fit onto jukeboxes, radio playlists, and dance floors with ease. By the mid-1960 period, his name was tied to the very identity of the city's music scene. Behind all of it stood Curtis Mayfield, offering songs that matched Major's strengths perfectly. Their partnership was built on familiarity, years of friendship, shared experiences, and mutual trust. Curtis understood how Major thought, how he moved, and how he sounded. Major trusted Curtis to give him the material that felt authentic. In an industry often shaped by competition, their connection was rare. As his presence grew, so did the expectations. But for a time, Major kept rising, building hit after hit while strengthening his place in the landscape of American soul music. What had started as a small chance at OK had grown into a career that touched audiences across the country and even overseas. In England, dancers and DJs embraced his sound, laying the early foundation for what would later become the Northern Soul movement. By the end of the decade, Major Lance was no longer the tall kid from Cabrini Green begging labels to give him a chance. He was a recognized name, a charting artist, and one of the central voices behind Chicago's most defining musical era. His breakthrough had arrived, and for a brief, bright period, he stood exactly where he had always dreamed of being, at the center of the music he loved. Success can be a strange thing. At its peak, it feels limitless, almost effortless. But underneath it, small fractures often begin forming long before anyone notices. For Major Lance, those fractures appeared quietly, hidden behind the applause, the television lights, and the bright optimism of Chicago soul. His rise had been fast, joyful, and full of motion, but the foundation supporting it was far more fragile than it seemed. The first major shift came when Curtis Mayfield and Johnny Pate left OK Records. Their departures weren't dramatic, but they were decisive. Without them, Major lost the creative circle that understood his strengths better than anyone. The chemistry that had carried him through his biggest hits was suddenly gone. In an era when a singer's survival depended on consistent support from producers, writers, and promoters, this loss was more devastating than the public would ever know. Major tried to continue recording with OK, working with other producers brought in to replace Mayfield's influence. But the formula was never the same. Songs lacked the spark that had once felt so natural. The grooves weren't as sharp, the melodies not as effortless. The impressions no longer provided harmonies. The studio space felt different. Without the team that had helped shape the identity of Chicago soul, Major found himself standing at the center of a sound that no longer fully belonged to him. Meanwhile, the music world outside OK was changing rapidly. The simplicity and sweetness of early 1960 soul were giving way to new styles. Funk was emerging with harder edges and more aggressive rhythms. Psychedelic soul was gaining momentum, blending political messages with experimental production. Major's warm, youthful tone, once his greatest asset, suddenly felt out of place in a landscape demanding bigger statements and bolder sounds. The charts reflected the shift. Singles that would have landed easily a few years earlier now struggled to get airplay. The music scene was becoming more competitive, and new voices were rising. Without a strong team behind him, Major's career began to slow. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a gradual dimming, the kind that happens quietly, almost invisibly, until one day the light isn't there anymore. In an effort to regain momentum, Major moved between labels. He released new singles through Decca Records, then Curtom Records, and later Volt. Some were promising, many were overlooked. Each switch represented hope, a belief that the next studio, the next producer, or the next sound might bring a breakthrough. But the industry had changed, and the music he was known for no longer defined the moment. Even so, Major remained a dedicated performer. He wasn't bitter, and he wasn't defeated. He loved the stage too much for that. But the reality was clear. Without consistent hits or strong label support, his national visibility faded. The man who once carried the spirit of Chicago soul now found himself navigating a career that felt uncertain and increasingly unstable. These weren't the dramatic tragedies that tabloids love to amplify. They were the quieter ones, the slow erosion of opportunity, the shifting of the industry, the loss of the people who understood him best. They were the kinds of changes that don't attract headlines but still break an artist down, piece by piece. Major Lance was still standing, still determined, still singing, but the world around him had changed, and the seeds of the struggles that would eventually define his later years had already been planted. The decline of a career rarely arrives with a single moment. More often, it begins quietly, through small wounds that deepen over time. For Major Lance, the early changes in the industry were only the beginning. As the music world shifted and his creative circle faded, pressure began gathering in ways he could no longer escape. What had once been a life filled with stages, applause, and youthful confidence slowly transformed into a daily struggle to stay afloat. By the mid-1960 period, Major was a husband and a father, doing everything he could to provide for a growing family. The financial responsibilities weighed heavily on him. Without steady hits, the security he once enjoyed disappeared. Still, he pushed forward, performing wherever he could, traveling from city to city, hoping that one more show, one more single, might bring his name back into the mainstream. But the pressures didn't remain professional. They soon became deeply personal. In 1965, Major faced a legal issue that would shadow him for years, an accusation under the Paternity Act. A Chicago woman claimed he was the father of her child and stated he had promised to pay for her medical expenses. When the payments were not made, a warrant was issued. For an artist still trying to maintain his footing in a competitive industry, the case brought unwanted attention. It wasn't a scandal that destroyed him, but it added weight to the burdens he was already carrying. The situation required time, money, and emotional strength, none of which he could spare easily. Even as legal troubles emerged, his career continued its slow, uneven trajectory. He signed with new labels, searched for new producers, and tried to reinvent himself. Some songs showed promise. Others faded quickly. The consistency he once enjoyed was gone, replaced by an unpredictable pattern of hope and disappointment. At times, he seemed close to a comeback. At others, the industry turned its back as if he no longer belonged. By the early 1970 period, his career in America had grown so unstable that he relocated to England, where he found unexpected success on the Northern Soul circuit. Audiences there adored him. They saw him not as a fading star, but as an icon whose music defined their dance halls. He performed with extraordinary enthusiasm, giving every show the same intensity he once brought to American stages. For a brief moment, it seemed he had found refuge. But the return to the United States brought him back to reality. The market had moved on. His style, once joyful and fresh, felt distant in a world shifting toward new genres and new ideas. The performances became smaller, the income unpredictable, the pressure greater than ever. In 1978, the pressure reached its breaking point. Major Lance was arrested on charges of cocaine possession. The conviction was devastating. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, a punishment that pushed him completely out of the spotlight and stripped away whatever momentum he had left. It wasn't just a legal sentence. It was an emotional one. For an artist who had fought tirelessly to be heard, prison felt like the world telling him his voice no longer mattered. And yet, even inside those walls, he refused to surrender completely. A part of him still believed in the possibility of redemption, even if the road ahead seemed darker than it had ever been. When Major Lance walked out of prison, the world he returned to was not the same one he had left behind. Time moves differently for artists. While the rest of the world keeps growing, changing, and forgetting, an artist sits frozen inside the moment when everything stopped. For Major, that moment had been painful, public, and impossible to outrun. Now, he faced the long road of trying to rebuild a life that had been shaken to its core. He didn't waste time. In 1983, he released an album titled "The Major is Back," hoping it would signal a new beginning. The title carried determination, maybe even defiance. But the music industry had shifted dramatically during his absence. Radio stations leaned toward new sounds, new faces, and new stories. The warm, upbeat soul that once made him a household name no longer dominated the airwaves. Even though he gave the project everything he had, it slipped quietly into the background, overlooked by a new generation that barely remembered his early triumphs. Still, Major refused to disappear. He performed wherever he could, in clubs, community events, and small stages scattered throughout the country. Some audiences remembered him with affection, others discovered him for the first time. But these performances were no longer the glamorous tours of his youth. They were carried by love, not fame by the need to stay connected to the music that had always kept him alive. But life had more battles waiting. In 1987, Major suffered a heart attack. It struck at a moment when he was trying to regain control of his future, cutting through his plans with a force he couldn't fight. Recovery was slow, draining, and uncertain. And as if his health hadn't taken enough from him, another condition began to steal something even more precious: his sight. Glaucoma crept in quietly, reducing his vision and making even simple tasks difficult. For a performer who once commanded stages with confidence, this was a cruel twist. The world grew dimmer, both figuratively and literally. The man who once stood tall under bright spotlights was now struggling to see them. Financial strain became a constant burden. With a large family to support and limited opportunities, he found himself navigating the kind of challenges most artists fear: being forgotten, not because of lack of talent, but because time had moved forward without him. Yet through it all, Major remained gentle, grateful, and hopeful. Those who knew him during these years spoke of his humility, his warmth, and his refusal to let bitterness shape him. Even as his health worsened, he held on to the stage for as long as he could. In 1994, he delivered what would become his final performance at the Chicago Blues Festival. Those who were there described a moment filled with courage, a man pushing past pain to offer one last gift to the city that had raised him. His voice wasn't as strong as it once was, but the heart behind it was unmistakable. Later that year, Major Lance passed away in his sleep at the age of 55, his life shaped by music, hardship, triumph, and the relentless will to keep going even when everything around him seemed to fade. He didn't leave this world with wealth or awards. He left with something far more lasting, a legacy that continued beating quietly inside the people who never stopped loving his music. Legacy is often measured by charts, awards, and headlines. But for artists like Major Lance, legacy lives in places far quieter, in the echoes of dance halls, in the memories of people who grew up with their music, and in the heartbeat of a city shaped by sound. Long after his final performance, long after his name faded from mainstream radio, the influence of Major Lance remained woven into the fabric of American soul. To understand his legacy, you have to return to Chicago. The city that raised him never forgot him. For many musicians who came after him, Major Lance represented the purest version of Chicago soul: joyful, rhythmic, full of life. His voice carried a kind of sweetness that felt uniquely Chicago, the sound of neighborhoods waking up on warm mornings, of street corners buzzing with conversation, of young people dancing their way through uncertain times. He was not simply a participant in the Chicago soul movement. He was one of its defining faces. Major helped carve out a sound that stood apart from the polished production of Detroit and the grittier tones of Memphis. Chicago soul was upbeat, bright, and accessible, and Major embodied all of that. His hits introduced countless listeners to the style, especially those who had never set foot in the city. Even listeners who didn't know his name could recognize the melodies, the grooves, and the unmistakable optimism his music carried. But his impact reached far beyond Chicago. In England, Major Lance became something far more than an American soul singer. He became a symbol. The Northern soul scene embraced him with an intensity few artists ever experience. Clubs across England filled with dancers spinning and sliding to the sound of the monkey time, um, 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 and countless others. When he performed live in the United Kingdom, audiences treated him like royalty. They saw him not as a forgotten figure from another era, but as a legend whose music fueled their nights and shaped their culture. His live album recorded at the Torch became one of the most celebrated recordings in the Northern Soul movement. Decades later, collectors still search for the original pressings, a testament to how deeply his music embedded itself into a community thousands of miles from where he was born. Major's style also influenced artists who followed him. Singers drawn to bright, melodic soul often studied his phrasing, his clarity, and his ability to make simple lyrics feel effortless. He showed young performers that soul didn't always have to be heavy or dramatic. It could be joyful, playful, and bursting with life. His music became a reference point for artists exploring the roots of American R&B, a quiet reminder of what made the early 1960 period so special. But perhaps the most powerful part of Major Lance's legacy is the human one. He carried himself with the same warmth that filled his voice. People who knew him remembered his kindness, his humility, his refusal to let bitterness define him even as the industry grew colder. His life became a story not just of success, but of perseverance, generosity, and courage. Major Lance didn't leave behind trophies or headlines. He left behind something far greater, a sound, a spirit, and a memory that still drifts through old records, plays softly in late-night radio shows, and lives in the hearts of those who believe music should first and always make people feel alive. By the time the world looked back on Major Lance's journey, the shine of his early fame had long faded, yet something remarkable happened in the years after his passing. The silence that had once surrounded his name began to shift. Listeners, critics, and musicians started to re-examine the music he left behind, and what they found was a legacy far more meaningful than the industry ever acknowledged during his lifetime. In America, conversations about Chicago soul often return to the same handful of names: Curtis Mayfield, Jerry Butler, The Impressions, all icons. Yet as the narrative of the genre continued to develop, many began to recognize that the story wasn't complete without Major Lance. His hits weren't just successful, they were foundational. They shaped the sound that defined a generation of Chicago musicians. Radio hosts revisiting the early 1960 period noted that without Major's charm and youthful energy, the Chicago soul movement might never have reached the national stage as quickly as it did. Music historians also pointed out how unique his tone was: light, warm, and instantly recognizable. He didn't sing from a place of heartbreak or sorrow. He sang from a place of joy, the kind of joy that made people move, laugh, and escape their troubles for a while. In a world filled with social tension and cultural upheaval, his music gave people something to hold on to, something brighter, something hopeful. The reassessment didn't stop in America. Across the ocean, the United Kingdom continued to celebrate him with a devotion that many American artists never experience. For fans of Northern soul, Major Lance wasn't an underrated singer. He was essential. His songs weren't just played, they were cherished. They became the heartbeat of late-night clubs, the soundtrack to youth movements, and the backdrop to friendships formed on crowded dance floors. Even decades later, his records remained staples in Northern soul collections, proving that true connection can outlast time and distance. As documentaries, radio specials, and retrospective articles emerged, more people began asking why Major Lance was never given wider recognition. Some wondered why he wasn't inducted into a Hall of Fame. Others questioned why his name didn't appear more often in conversations about the greatest voices of his era. These questions weren't rooted in nostalgia alone. They were rooted in truth, the truth that Major Lance helped shape a musical era, but didn't receive his share of acknowledgement. With time, musicians who admired him began to speak. They talked about his phrasing, his stage presence, and the ease with which he could turn a simple melody into something unforgettable. Younger artists studying the roots of R&B discovered his work and found a blueprint for clean, melodic soul. Radio shows dedicated segments to him, celebrating the warmth and joy his music carried. Slowly, the world began to correct the oversight. Yet perhaps the clearest sign of his lasting legacy is found in the people who grew up listening to him. They speak of childhood memories tied to his records, weddings, family gatherings, block parties, nights spent dancing in kitchens and living rooms. Major Lance's music wove itself into everyday life in ways that statistics could never measure. His journey was not perfect. His struggles were real. But in the end, what remained was a voice that brought people together, a sound that captured the spirit of a city, and a legacy that proved you don't need a star on a sidewalk to be remembered. For many, Major Lance was more than an artist. He was a feeling, one that still lives on. When you look back at the story of Major Lance, it's impossible not to return to the image of a stage in Chicago, the same kind of stage where a young man once stood under bright lights, singing with a joy that seemed to rise straight from the neighborhoods that raised him. In those early days, the world felt wide open. The music was fresh, the audiences were alive, and his voice carried the promise of a future that seemed as bright as the city skyline at night. But life rarely unfolds the way it begins. The same lights that once embraced him eventually dimmed. Opportunities faded. Expectations changed. And the man who once brought so much movement to American dance floors found himself fighting battles few ever saw. Yet even as his path grew heavier, he never lost the warmth that made his music unforgettable. He carried that warmth until the very end. What remains now is the truth that time often hides but never erases. Major Lance helped shape the sound of Chicago soul. He brought joy to people who needed it. He stood at the center of a movement that carried music from local streets to international dance hall. And even though his later years were marked by struggle, he continued giving, performing, singing, and offering whatever strength he had left. That is the heart of his legacy. For those who grew up with his songs, he is a reminder of simpler days filled with laughter and movement. For those discovering him now, he is proof that not all legends wear crowns or fill stadiums. Some legends live quietly, carried in the memories of those who refuse to forget. Some legends shine in places where the spotlight no longer reaches. And so the question remains, did Hollywood, or the music industry at large, ever give Major Lance the respect he truly deserved? Many listeners would say no. Many believe his name belongs in a hall of fame not just for his hits, but for the joy, spirit, and cultural heartbeat he brought to his era. Whether or not he ever receives that honor, the truth is simple. His music already lives where honors matter most, in the hearts of the people who felt it. As we close this story, you can almost hear the distant echo of a Chicago stage, the applause, the horn section warming up, the rhythm kicking in. You can almost see him stepping out, smiling the way he always did, ready to give everything he had one more time. If his story touched you, if his music brought back a memory or stirred something familiar, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment. Tell us where you first heard his voice, or which song still makes you move. And if you believe stories like his deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us keep the light alive for the artists the world once loved and should never forget. Because the world may have moved on, but here, their stories continue.